Everybody, today we will be learning a little bit about the politics that was going on in Western Europe between the years 1450 and 1550. The basic goals for this video are as listed below. Please make sure you can answer these questions by the time the video is over. Alright, so let's start out by talking about a couple of general trends for what is happening during this time period. And the main thing that we're going to see, and the main thing we're going to focus on in today's video, is the emergence of a few powerful centralized monarchies. These especially are France, England, and the Habsburg domains that include Spain, parts of Germany, and also the Netherlands. Another thing that we're going to see in all of these kingdoms is the struggle between the centralizing monarch and the decentralizing nobility, similar to what we saw in feudal Japan. The monarchs want to have all control concentrated in themselves, whereas the nobility want the king to be weak, that way they can do whatever they want. We're also going to see a lot of competition between the leading royal houses. So as Spain and France and England emerge as the strongest states, they'll begin competing with each other, both economically and militarily, trying to gain the upper hand in Western Europe. So let's start with France. So France was greatly weakened after the 100 Years' War, which occupied most of the late medieval period for France. And when France emerged from this war, what it was not so much a kingdom, but a patchwork of independent noble lands. There was a king, but the king was weaker than many of the nobles. Basically, the king had to listen to what the nobles said, not the other way around. This began to change when Louis XI took power in 1461. He was a cunning and opportunistic political player, and he was known by many as the Spider. And he struggled against the nobles to gain control of territory in France. And he did this in a couple of sneaky ways. One way that he used was that whenever a nobleman died, and that nobleman did not have a male heir, he would take over that land and claim it in the name of the king. And in this way, he was able to expand his lands and become more powerful than the nobles around him. He was also able to use strategic marriage to draw powerful noble houses into the royal camp. He would marry off his sons and his daughters to his opponents to win them over to his side. In these two ways, the French king, by the year 1500, had amassed a bunch of land that he controlled directly. In order to administer all of this land, Louis XI also established the right for the king to tax non-noble Frenchmen. So this meant that the king was allowed to directly tax people that lived even on the lands of other noblemen. And this gave the French king the money he needed to run the French government, to build roads and to establish courts, but also, and most importantly, to build a centrally controlled national army that the king paid for out of his own pocket. And this meant that the army was loyal not to the nobles around France, but loyal exclusively to the king. Now let's move on to England. So England also faces a great period of instability and warfare, even greater than France's, because they first go through the 100 Years' War as France's opponent, and they actually lose this war. And then, on top of this, they enter into a 30-year-long civil war known as the War of the Roses. It was a war fought between the leading noble houses of England for control of the English throne. And basically, the noblemen of England just spend 30 years slaughtering each other with no clear winner. But after those 30 years is up, the English nobility is so exhausted that Henry VII, a minor noble, is able to take control of the crown and declare himself king. And So clearly he takes control of a bad situation after more than 130 years of war. But he's pretty smart, and he manages to pick up the pieces for England pretty well. The first thing he does is he uses strategic marriage to win the loyalty of opponents from the War of the Roses. So even though nobody really supports him when he takes over, he's able to marry into important noble families to get his rivals onto his side. He also uses the unique English institution known as Parliament to win the cooperation of the nobles. Basically, in Parliament, the nobles are allowed to make up the laws that will govern them. It's one of history's first instances of a representative body. And so the English king grants Parliament certain rights. Henry VII grants certain rights. And in response for giving them these certain rights, the nobles are willing to work with him to rebuild England. And the last thing he does is he establishes a very efficient governmental system with specific offices for specific duties, stuff like tax collection and law enforcement. And in this way, Henry's moving away from a sort of basic medieval government to a professional modern government with specific duties and responsibilities. And last and perhaps most impressively, we have the Habsburg realm, which by the year 1520 grows to encompass all of the territory you see on this map here in blue, including Spain, Austria, and the Netherlands. And it all begins through a particularly prudent marriage between Ferdinand and Isabella. These were two monarchs of Spain, and they marry and thereby join Spain into a single powerful nation. On top of this, they are able to reconquer all of the Spanish territory that had been taken over by Islamic armies long ago during the Middle Ages. So finally, after almost 700 years, Christians have reconquered Spain. On top of this, the Spanish in the same year also are able to claim a huge empire in the New World. Huge chunks of South America and Central America become directly controlled by the Spanish kings. All of this is passed on to their grandson, Charles V, who becomes king not only of Spain, but also of the Netherlands and Austria. And this is because of a series of marriages that Ferdinand and Isabella had arranged so that their heirs would become not only the kings of Spain, but the kings of all of these places. And so the Habsburgs, under Charles V, become the most powerful house in Europe. It's easily the largest hold of any European family, and his power is growing year by year as Spain conquers more of the New World. And this leads Charles V to imagine that he might be able to conquer all of Europe and bring about European unity once again. Charles V does not succeed in this attempt. What we see instead of any one of these great houses emerging as the ruler of Europe is we see an ongoing centuries-long conflict between these three great powers. And this would come to define European history for the next couple hundred years. As these centralized and powerful kingdoms competed with each other, both militarily, economically, and culturally, we would see some of the most gruesome wars in human history. Wars that ranged for decades, for almost centuries at a time. But we would also see periods of rapid technological and economic progress because these kingdoms had to stay at the cutting edge of technology if they wanted to survive. And that's a really interesting process, and we're going to be spending a lot of time thinking more about this as time goes on. So here's a map of what Europe looks like around 1500. And so you'll see those tiny little specks in the middle. That's Germany and Italy. And more or less, that's what all of Europe looked like before the centralizing monarchs of Western Europe came around. But so compare Germany to France and England and Spain. France and England and Spain have united all of the tiny little nobilities into a couple big, powerful nations, and they're able to exert their influence and dominate European politics up until around the year 1800, let's say. And they remain powerful even after then. Alright, so that's what we've got today. All of this stuff will be super relevant for the Reformation, which we're going to start talking about tomorrow. Basically, the Reformation is a religious struggle, but it plays out as a political competition between the great houses that we have just been talking about.